Okay, so very good morning to Satyaki and very good evening to all our viewers in YouTube Live and also Chandri. And today we have the second lecture in our IEEE CS Kolkata section organized webinar series on listening from the budding technocrats. So today we have with us Satyaki Chakraborty is one of our ex-students, passed out in 2017 with us, and his lecture will be on deep learning without labels. So Satyaki is in Amazon AWS right now. So we are really happy to have Satyaki here with us. I now request Dr. Chandri Chaudhuri, faculty member of Computer Science and Engineering Department of Jadavpur University, to formally introduce Satyaki. And I remember, like, Satyaki was also a student in our software engineering lab that myself and Chandri used to take. And again, on behalf of CS chapter of IEEE Kolkata section, I welcome Satyaki to this webinar session. Over to Chandri.
Thank you so much, Professor Basu. So it is my privilege to have the opportunity to introduce Mr. Satyaki Chakraborty. It is a proud moment for us as faculty members of the Computer Science and Engineering Department to introduce him. And you will know the reason once I finish the introduction. So Satyaki graduated from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, Jadavpur University, in the year 2017, as Professor Basu has also said. During those years, he was not only popular among his batchmates, but also achieved quite a few accolades. As an undergraduate student, his work won the second prize in Google Developers Group Kolkata Hackathon in 2015. His publication from the B project work, Learning Representations for Place Recognition in Simultaneous Localization and Mapping, received the Best Student Paper Award at the International Conference of Pattern Recognition and Machine Intelligence in 2016. In the same year, he received the prestigious S.N. Bose Scholarship for Indo-US Exchange Visitors. So he had visited Carnegie Mellon University for his summer internship. Undoubtedly, he was among the top 10 students of his class at Jadavpur University. And he has also secured the 6th rank in the Madhyamik examination at the 10th standard. Later, he obtained a Master of Science in Robotics from the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. During his master's, he was the recipient of the US National Science Foundation Scholarship Grant, which covered full tuition waiver and stipend. You see how amazing, isn't it? So he is currently working as an applied scientist in Amazon Web Services, AWS, Seattle, Washington. As a student at Carnegie Mellon University and as a scientist at Amazon, he has worked with renowned scientists on robotics and computer vision. Currently, he is working with Stefano Suato's group in AWS, and his domain of interest is representation learning. So, Satyaki, we are all waiting to hear from you.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thanks for the kind introduction. I think you've oversold me, and now I'm a little bit anxious. But and first of all, thank you for inviting me to this talk. I'm really fortunate to be able to present some of the ideas that's currently going on in deep learning research. So I will actually get started right away if there is nothing else at this point.
Okay, so I'm just adding your presentation into the stream. And okay, that's good. So it's all for you.
Okay. So yeah, so basically the topic that I wanted to discuss today is deep learning, but without labels. So essentially, as you can see that this is mostly going to be around some of the recent advances in the domain of unsupervised or self-supervised learning. And the reason why I'm going to talk about this is because most of my current research at AWS is sort of based on this. And this is also a very sort of interesting topic in the research community right now. Sorry, am I still audible? Because the background noise just went away. Hello?
It's audible. Perfect. It's perfect.
Okay.
You can continue.
Okay, sorry. So anyway, so yeah, and this is actually a really hot topic right now in the research community. And I'm going to actually first discuss, like motivate the audience to sort of understand why this particular problem is of utmost importance. And I'm also going to give some real life examples and why solving this problem is necessary. And this is not exactly my research. Instead, this is more like because my particular research is more the scope is very narrow since I work in the industry right now. This is more like a very general overview, and this particular set of ideas that I'm going to talk about, they have a much broader scope. So I thought that would be of more interest to the community or to the audience. Another thing is that I will try to make the slides or my talk less mathematical, so that I can talk mostly about from the idea perspective at the high level and sort of have an engaging discussion. So yeah, so this is basically the contents of my presentation today. I'm going to first motivate the audience to understand why this problem is worth solving and why this problem right now deserves some attention. I'm going to talk about the scope of this problem. So in the last 5-10 years, we have seen a lot of different subproblems in deep learning coming up. Where does this problem of unsupervised or self-supervised learning fit in? I'm going to give an overview. So some of the terminology, some of the definitions, and some some evaluation protocols, and what is the key idea, or what is the expectation that we have from these kind of algorithms and this kind of research. And I'm also going to talk about some key ideas, some key breakthroughs that has happened over the past couple of years, actually. I'm not going to discuss, so this is not a literature review, so I'm not going to go into the details of each and every single paper, but rather I will try to connect the papers and how that research has developed and what are some of the future directions of this kind of work. But at any point of time, feel free to stop me and ask me questions if there are questions out there. Yeah. So, and anyway, I'm going to check after I cover every single section. If there are some questions from the audience. So, okay. So we are getting started with the main section of the presentation. So, we have always heard that deep learning systems are data hungry, and that is a very popular saying in both within the deep learning community as well as outside the deep learning community. And this statement has different small pieces to it, and you can actually ask lots of questions from this statement. And also, one of the first questions is that what are these kind of systems that are data hungry? So when people say that deep learning systems are data hungry, they mean deep end-to-end systems. Contrary to popular belief, deep learning systems are not always end-to-end. You can actually have, in fact, there are lots of new research directions that are coming up that are sort of building deep learning systems, but in a more modular fashion. They don't have as big of a problem with respect to data as much as deep end-to-end systems have. But yeah, when people say that deep learning systems or deep learning models are data hungry, they actually refer to end-to-end systems. And so what are end-to-end systems? So in the classical machine learning, the setting of classical machine learning, we used to have inputs, raw inputs, and we used to have some kind of algorithm for engineering the features. And we used to pass these engineered features to our classification or some kind of machine learning algorithm and do our end tasks, such as classification. So deep learning came, and what deep learning suggested was that we are going to do this end task such as classification. But while doing so, we are actually going to learn these features from the data itself. So essentially, given x's and y's, which is inputs and outputs, we are going to use some mathematical model to sort of directly learn to map the x's to y's. So in some sense, you are learning a function approximator. And the reason we can do this function approximation for almost all functions is because we are taking advantage of nonlinearity. So we are stacking layers one top of another through nonlinearities, and the model is differentiable end to end. So that's the end-to-end system where we are trying to directly predict the output from the input. Now, why are these systems or models data hungry? So if you think about data, end-to-end systems, they actually need to see a lot of data to be able to understand, what features are important and what features are not. So given any kind of input, let's say the faces of human beings or celebrities, and let's say you are doing some end task, like let's say celebrity classification, or like want to classify Barack Obama versus other people and so on. Some information that is present in the input are actually important features, like maybe the skin tone or the facial structure and so on. But some information that is present in the input, like let's say the background or maybe the pose or orientation of the facial expression and all these things are actually not important. So this information that is important, we call them features, and the information that is not important, we call that noise. And in order for the deep learning system to work properly, it has to learn invariances. So it has to be invariant with respect to all these different kinds of noise signals. And in order for it to do that, it needs to see all possible combinations of this relevant information and noise to be able to learn that, okay, so these are the things that I need to ignore, and these are the things that I need to capture to be able to classify Barack Obama correctly. So this is called combinatorial generalization, and deep learning suffers, end-to-end systems actually suffer from that. So now the question is, like, if it suffers from that, then why is that a bad thing? Like, how does it impact us? So for image classification, actually the problem is that if you talk about this end-to-end deep supervised models, there are two parts to it. Two parts to the data that we use to train this. One is the input and the output. And input is usually it occupies a lot more space because we're talking about images, videos, high resolution inputs, and so on and so forth. But annotations, they occupy little less space in terms of storage. But the thing is, annotations are very, very difficult to collect. So this is basically one of the self-driving car datasets, and for semantic segmentation. And annotating one frame takes about 1.5 hours. So if you want to more or less precisely annotate the image, you take about 1.5 hours for a single person. And a self-driving car collects around 10 to 20 terabytes of data per hour. So getting all that data annotated, and they have been collecting data for years. So getting all that data annotated, it's almost impossible. So in fact, there is a scarcity in terms of annotators. In fact, this has sort of opened up a new section of entrepreneurship, to be honest. So the idea is to sort of be able to annotate efficiently at a large scale for all these startups related to AI and all of that. And we are actually still in the early phases of like saturating in this particular domain. And these startups are actually heavily funded startups, and they're really popular in the West Coast here in the US. So the thing is that, we try to engineer our way or try to get a lot of annotators to sort of get a lot of data annotated. And the other way of doing this is basically, maybe we can start to think about building models or architectures that don't really rely on annotation. So again, the data hungry part is still there. We still are going to rely on the inputs a lot, but we are going to get rid of the annotations, and we are going to solely rely on the inputs to be able to do machine learning. And according to Jan LeCun, the future of machine learning is unsupervised, which is exactly what he tries to. I think this is what he's trying to say, that we should stop sort of relying on the annotations to do machine learning at scale. So where does the scope of unsupervised or self-supervised representation learning fit in? So we had already seen supervised, semi-supervised, and unsupervised for a long time. So in supervised, let's say this is binary classification task, we have all the data that we need, and we also have we have all the labels for all the data. So we are going to train a supervised classifier. For unsupervised, we have the data, we have the inputs, but we don't have labels, and we would like to understand how this data is like maybe some different semantic properties of this data even without labels. For semi-supervised, we have a lot of unlabeled data. So it is important that we have a lot of unlabeled data for semi-supervised learning algorithms to work, but a few labeled data, and those are basically they provide the seed information, and we are going to propagate that information to all these unlabeled data. So, and they have been there for quite some time. In the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, a new, or maybe even longer, a new branch of learning with low annotation came up, which is few-shot learning. And that is a little bit different from the standard paradigms. The idea for few-shot learning is that we have some classes. We have some classes with few instances, and let's say in this particular case we have a parrot class and an owl class, and we have only like 2 or 3 examples of these particular classes, and we call these classes with few instances as novel classes. But we also have a reference set. So we have a reference set containing instances of other kinds of birds, and we somehow want to extract some information from these this reference set and apply and use that information for these novel classes, and be able to learn a good classifier for these classes which don't have a lot of instances. So that is few-shot learning. And few-shot learning has also its own variants. Like one-shot learning is an example where you only have one instance for every single novel class, and you still like to do a pretty good job for these novel classes. And then there is zero-shot learning, where you actually don't have any instance of these classes, but you would still like to do well for these classes. And that's its own branch of study. And typically, you have to rely on some on information from some external source, like some knowledge corpus or something like that. Text corpus or something like that. So yeah, so supervised. Unsupervised or self-supervised learning is not really zero-shot or anything like that. It just means that we want to learn good representations in the absence of labels. In terms of the data and annotation burden, it is minimal because it doesn't really need any kind of annotation to learn good representations, and that is what we want to essentially solve with unsupervised or self-supervised learning. Are there any questions in the audience? Okay, I guess not.
Not really. You can continue. Then we'll have, since this is a live session, so they will have questions through live stream comments, and then I'll add the questions at the last.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay, so then what is self-supervised learning? So in self-supervised learning, the fundamental idea is that in absence of labels or annotations, we are actually going to create supervisory signals from the input data itself. So this is our classic setting of supervised learning, where we have inputs and outputs, and we try to build a function approximator where we try to map the inputs to outputs. But in absence of labels, we don't really have whys. So the idea is that we are going to create 2 different components of the input. Let's say the input is x. Now I'm going to create x prime and x double prime from the input, and I'm going to try to predict x double prime from x prime. So essentially, it's still like supervision, because I'm trying to use x prime to predict x double prime. But the thing is that both x prime and x double prime are coming from the same input, so we don't really have to rely on y anymore. And there are no sort of like constraints on x prime and x double prime. Essentially, they can be the same thing. They can be also same as x. All that matters is that we are actually creating the supervision signal from the input data itself. And the second part of it is like representation learning. So what do we mean by representation learning? So the idea is that we learn a good embedding space that we can from which we can easily transfer to downstream tasks. And the downstream tasks we usually have very few annotations, or we would like to train really fast in that domain of downstream task. So here's an example of a bad embedding space. actually the embedding space or representations can, whether it's good or bad, might actually depend on the downstream task. And in most cases it does. So let's say the downstream task is to classify between birds and dogs. If our representation that we have learned using our self-supervised learning algorithm is like this, where everything is just spread out over the embedding space with no proper structure, then that's a bad embedding space. And whereas in this particular setting, if we have sort of clustered these semantic concepts such as dogs and birds together, even if we didn't know that they were actually dogs or birds, then that's actually a good embedding space for us, because in this particular case, we can actually get a linear classifier and draw a decision boundary between these two sort of cluster centers. So that basically means that when you want to train in a downstream task like image classification, we don't really have to do a lot of work. We can train really fast, or we can train with just few annotations. So that's the idea of good embedding space versus bad embedding space. So what is the sort of paradigm, or what is sort of the the main components of self-supervised learning, or what are the steps of or stages of self-supervised learning? So usually you use self-supervised learning for pre-training, and unfortunately that is currently the only application, if I'm not wrong, of self-supervised learning. So the idea is that in absence of labels, we are going to use a lot of unannotated data to learn these rich embedding spaces. And we are going to use something called a pretext task, which is essentially some task that is going to act as a proxy for the supervised task. And it could be a lot of things, like, let's say I want to color images, or I want to, let's say, so again, if you think about it, we are going to create X prime and X double prime in some way. And X prime can be the black and white version of the image, and X double prime could be the actual colored image, and we would like to predict the color of the image from the black and white version. And these kind of tasks that we artificially create are called pretext tasks. And we are going to use these kind of tasks to actually learn some useful representations of the inputs. And once we have learned this representation, we are actually going to do transfer learning. So now we have the downstream task, maybe with few annotations, or we'd like to train really fast. So from this rich embedding space, we are going to do some fine tuning on this entire architecture by plugging in some kind of module. Let's say if it's a classifier, then we are going to attach maybe a dense layer for classification. If it's object detection, we are going to attach, ROI and all those things. For segmentation, we're going to attach a segmentation head. So after this representation, we're going to attach a module that is specific to that task, and probably fine tune with, hopefully in fewer steps or with few data points. So yeah, and so the first stage is basically self-supervised pre-training. We learn the embedding space. The second stage is, given this embedding space, we are going to fine tune the architecture end to end, and do and learn our algorithm efficiently in this downstream task. Fine-tuning itself is its own branch of study. It, I think, falls under continual learning, but I'm going to not include that in this presentation. Okay, so what are the utilities or applications of self-supervised learning? So one thing is that we have started to see that if we do self-supervised pre-training correctly, by the way, this example is not of colorization. This example is of rotation prediction. So here, your X prime is essentially a rotated version of the image, and your X double prime is basically the angle of rotation. And so given a rotated version of the image, I'm going to predict the angle of rotation, and that is going to help me learn this representation. It is good feature memory. I'm actually going to discuss all these ideas later on. But for now, yeah, so what are the utilities of this kind of self-supervised learning algorithm? So one thing is that we have started to see that if we have a good pretext task or a good self-supervised learning algorithm, we can actually get a huge improvement in the downstream task. And sometimes doing self-supervised learning actually improves the performance than just doing supervised. So self-supervised and then fine-tuning can actually outperform just supervised on this downstream task. And we have started to see some results like that. The second thing is that, like I said, we want to learn from few annotations. And if we already have a rich embedding space or rich representation space, then we can actually learn from few annotations. And also we can also converge really fast, because most of the semantic concepts are already grouped together in the embedding space or something. So there's not really a lot for the neural network to learn. A lot of the difficult tasks is already sort of there. Then this other thing is basically unsupervised retrieval. So, like I said, typically, especially with a lot of pretest tasks, what you can do is you can sort of group these semantic concepts together in the embedding space. So, what that means is images that sort of belong to the same semantic concept, let's say an object or something like that, their representations or embeddings are going to form clusters in the embedding space, so they'll be very close to each other. So what you can do is, given a query image, you can map it to the embedding space, get that representation, then do something like nearest neighbor search, or maybe take the take the minimum cosine distance, take the representation with minimum cosine distance, and project it back to the image space, and get all these kinds of what are some of these sort of visually similar images that are present in our database. So this is sort of image retrieval, unsupervised, and we can do that pretty well with our self-supervised learning algorithms. Another application that people have started to use is basically out of distribution detection or novelty detection. And the idea is that, well, this is actually in the context of supervised learning. So let's say this is an example of where our green data points and orange data points are actually only they belong to the training data set. So if we actually built a classifier based on these examples, we would do a linear a decision boundary somewhere around here. So in test time, well, let's say these are examples of cat, which are actually far away from the representations of dogs and birds. But since we have trained a supervised end-to-end model, the supervised model doesn't know that these are actually cats. So based on which side of the decision boundary it is, it's actually going to predict it as dogs or birds. Maybe with low probabilities, but it's still going to predict them as dogs or birds, and not some like it's never going to be able to say that this is actually neither dogs or not birds. It's actually something else. It doesn't know that it's cats, but it will never be able to say that it's something else. So this is actually something called out of distribution detection, which basically means a sample during test time is not really from our training distribution. And it's actually a hard problem. And but with self-supervised learning, what we can do is we can actually build a rich representation space, and we can actually, model this representation space with something like Gaussians, and sort of understand when a model, when a sample is coming during test time, whether it's from the test training distribution or it's outside the training distribution. So we can actually do out of distribution detection or novelty detection with self-supervised learning. So here's actually a paper which actually does that, which came out last year. Okay, so the thing is that, again, what are some of the metrics or evaluation protocols for sort of evaluating self-supervised learning algorithms? Since this is just representation learning, there are no metrics directly that you can use to sort of, at least not that I'm aware of, that you can use to sort of understand how good your representations are. But there are some evaluation protocols using which we can actually understand how good our self-supervised learning algorithm is. So one thing is that once we have actually learned these representations, we can actually add a linear classifier like SEM on top of this sort of backbone, like convolute backbone that is going to predict the representations, and then use the output of that classifier to sort of understand how good these representations were learned. And the idea, and why do you want to use a linear classifier, is because if you use a nonlinear classifier, let's say a network, a deep network as a classifier itself, then you will actually learn even more abstractions inside that classifier, and you don't want to do that. Then you will never really understand how good the representations were from these backbone. So yeah, so that's the reason why you would want a linear classifier. The second thing is annotation efficiency. So what in this particular evaluation protocol, what you do is you basically, given a data set, you learn the self-supervised learning algorithm without the labels, and then you don't take the entire set of annotations. You maybe take 1% or 2% of the annotated data, and then you try to essentially do semi-supervised learning. And the hope is that with just a little amount of annotated data, you will be able to sort of do really well. And if your algorithm is doing really well, then well, your self-supervised algorithm is self-supervised learning algorithm is really good. And the other thing is transfer learning. And here what we do is we study how easily we can transfer these representations to one or more downstream tasks. So let's say we have a self-supervised learning algorithm. We have learned these representations, and especially in computer vision, let's say we have a lot of downstream tasks like classification, object detection, semantic segmentation, instance segmentation, and so on and so forth. And we would want to, and from this initialization of the network, from this sort of representation, if we initialize the network with the weights that we used after after we used learned our self-supervised learning algorithm, then and if it converges really fast and we get really good performance in these downstream tasks, then we can say that our self-supervised learning algorithm is really well, because the representations that we have learned, they actually transfer very well to multiple downstream tasks. So these are the three evaluation protocols that people often use for evaluating self-supervised learning algorithms. So the question is, does SSL work in practice? So this is essentially a paper from January 2020. It's actually a very famous paper called Sinclair, which is actually authored by Jeffrey Hinton, co-authored Jeffrey Hinton. And so in January 2020, we were almost catching up with supervised. So this is a fully supervised algorithm, and these are all unsupervised and self-supervised algorithms. And in as of January 2020, we actually made a huge progress in the domain of self-supervised learning, where we are almost catching up with supervised. 6 months later, in NeurIPS, the same year, we actually saw a lot more publications that came out. And in fact, now Sinclair, that was over here, is now over this. So there are lots of papers that came out that actually came in between supervised and Sinclair. And we are actually catching up. Again, we are closing the gap between supervised and self-supervised algorithms. And this was June 2020. So after that, a lot more papers came out, and we are even closing the gap even further. And this is actually pretty interesting because in just a year, we actually are catching very close to the supervised algorithms. And it's very important because we are not really, these are not like semi-supervised or few shot learning. This is completely unsupervised. And by the way, this evaluation, how this is done is we use our self-supervised learning algorithm to learn these representations, and then we feed a linear classifier on top of this coordinate backbone, and then we do the evaluation. So this is basically self-supervised learning algorithm plus linear classifier, and that that is actually performing really well. And maybe, I don't know, in the next few years we might even beat supervised in some way. So I'm going to talk about some of the early ideas. So now I'm going to this section where I'm going to talk about how these ideas have evolved throughout different years, and basically a timeline of these ideas. If you think about it, we have actually been doing self-supervised learning for quite some time without actually calling it self-supervised. So some of the earliest works, like denoising autoencoders, which came out in 2008, they are actually self-supervised learning algorithms. So in this particular case, X prime is essentially a noisy or corrupted version of the input, and X double prime is essentially the original input. And we want to sort of reconstruct this original input from a corrupted version of it. That is essentially self-supervised. All other kinds of autoencoders, like sparse autoencoders and all these things, are also essentially self-supervised, because in sparse autoencoders, we want to basically have the same input and output, but we have some sparsity constraint inside the autoencoder. So over there, X prime and X double prime are actually the same, and they are same as X. In NLP, NLP actually heavily relies on self-supervised learning algorithms, because these word embeddings that people use are essentially self-supervised learning algorithms. The algorithms to learn word embeddings are self-supervised learning algorithms. So some examples are continuous bag of words and skipgram models. So the idea is that it's continuous bag of words. Given a context of a word, we try to break the word. So let's say chased is the word, then the context is the cat, the mouse. So given the cat, the mouse, I'm going to break the word chased, and going to learn some representations for every single word. And the opposite is skipgram, where given a word, I'm trying to predict the context. And so this is essentially self-supervised learning. So this is X prime and this is X double prime. So in the vision community, people started adapting these things a little bit later. So one of the earliest proper research on self-supervised learning was in 2016 from UC Berkeley, where people try to build context encoders. So the idea is that, okay, so one thing about this is that this kind of sort of adding corrupted input, where you sort of add corruption at the pixel level, worked really well for MNIST datasets because, first of all, they're really small, and these corruptions made a lot of sense because these images are binary or to some extent grayscale. But as you scale these approaches to larger images, maybe from ImageNet, they don't really work that well. And because this corruption is sort of easy to get rid of by the network to some extent. And as you move from autoencoders to convolutional autoencoders, where successive convolution operations are going to sort of average out this kind of noise. So people started with a really hard task. So what they did is they cut out a certain section of the image. So they cropped it out, and they tried to predict the entire image. So given a cut out portion of the image, I'm going to predict what the image looks like. And that is basically going to be my pretext task. And I'm hopefully going to learn good representations from that. And they actually did really well. It was actually one of the pioneers for pioneering research for taking the field of self-supervised learning and computer vision forward. But it also has its own limitations, which is it's actually a very, very difficult task for the neural network to learn, because the first thing is that it has to get the shape correct. So if the crab had a different kind of shape depending on the species, then, well, it's really hard for the neural network to learn that. It has to sort of get these exact matches around the boundaries. It also has to predict the color exactly. And there's also a lot of ambiguity with respect to inpainting. So inpainting basically means the painting a cropped out portion of the image. Now, the thing is, there is ambiguity. And the reason why there is ambiguity is because, I don't know, like, for example, let's say this particular sailboat, there could be a lot of people that are standing there. There could be no people. Maybe there's someone was fishing, and all these answers are correct answers, actually. There is not one single correct answer. So based on the data, we are only going to say that, okay, if you don't get this exact match, then you're wrong. And that is a little bit wrong for the neural network. And also the neural network actually spends a lot of its effort sort of getting these low-level details correct, and getting these low-level details correct, like these boundaries and all of that, doesn't necessarily mean that we are actually learning a lot of, or spending a lot of effort to learn useful representations. So the next idea was colorization. So if you think about it, if we don't have to predict the entire sort of group of pixels together, then we don't have to predict a lot of things like, let's say, the shape of the object, or what are some of the possible occurrences in that particular situation, like was there a person who was fishing, was there a person who was just lying down, and all of this, because all this information related to the events happening and all of that is already present in the image. It's just that we have to predict the color. And another thing is that in the natural world, a lot of things actually have more or less the same color. Like, for example, the sky is always blue, the grass is always green, and all of that. So we can actually take advantage of the statistical bias in the natural world, and learn to colorize images and then build self-supervised representations. Now, but again, this is not. There is still some ambiguity. For example, if we just look at this grayscale image, we don't really know what color this fish is. It could be green and white. It could be blue and yellow, and a lot of other things. So there's actually, again, we are actually coming back to this multimodal sort of distribution where there's not only one correct answer, there are multiple correct answers, and we expect the neural network to get only one of them right. And it's saying that in other cases it's wrong, which is actually incorrect. So people went on to, by the way, there are actually some intermediate research works that I have skipped. So the idea, the reason I skipped them is because I wanted to pick some of them that actually conveys a sort of a milestone idea, according to me, and I could be wrong, but like, and also for brevity of discussing the different ideas, I wanted to cover the key ideas that have actually tried to bring in something new and some new perspective. So there are actually some intermediate papers that obviously did some iterative improvement, but I'm going to skip some of them and directly go into some of these milestone papers, or papers that became a lot popular. So another work was rotation prediction. So if you think about it, if we try to predict images or pixels, where instance sort of basically try to build some sort of generative model, then it comes with its own complexity, and we sort of get lost in sort of getting these trivial details correct, and that getting those trivial details correct are actually really hard, like the color matches and the boundary matches and all of that. So this work, what they proposed is that they are going to rotate the image. So the X prime is now a rotated version of the image, and there are 4 rotations that they're going to do based on a multiple of 90 degrees. And for every single rotation, they're going to predict how what is the angle of rotation. So that is going to be my pretest task, and that is going to help me learn the representations. Now the question is, how is that better than the previous methods? Well, we are not really trying to predict those pixels and those trivial details related to those pixels. So we are just trying to predict orientation. So that problem is taken care of. But the second thing is that I mean, given an image, well, how can we even say that this particular image was rotated by 90 degrees from the original image? Well, again, the answer to that is there is actually a lot of statistical bias in the natural data, natural world, if we consider orientation from an orientation perspective. So, for example, for this particular image of bird, these 2 images are very unlikely. A bird is less likely to stand like this or like this. It's probably going to stand like this or this. But if you take pictures of birds, lots of pictures of birds, then it's in that particular situation, you are most likely to find a bird that is looking sort of straight than looking down. I mean, birds rarely look down unless they don't want to catch a prey or something like that. So there is actually a lot of statistical bias in the natural data, and these sort of algorithms try to capitalize on that. So a recap on these ideas. So we started with a very complex task that was taking a lot of effort from the neural network's perspective to get a lot of things correct that we thought was not really necessary. We moved on to sort of getting the predictions, getting rid of the structure or getting rid of the information content of the image to and went forward with just colorizing the image. That way, we sort of don't have to worry about shape and all this information content and all these things. Then from there, we actually moved on to some orientation, predicting the orientation or rotation in this case. That way, we don't really have to get the pixels correct, and we don't have this ambiguity in terms of multiple modalities in the distribution space. In the input space. Yeah. So, but the thing is that even right now, we don't really have a correct answer of like. By the way, for elementary pretext task, rotation prediction actually works really well. But the thing is that we don't know why rotation prediction. We cannot say with certainty that rotation prediction is the pretext task that we need to use to solve unsupervised learning. There is some pretext task that we haven't really explored, which is a better task than rotation prediction, and we cannot just keep on engineering these kind of tasks to sort of learn better representations. So so we are going to revisit the embedding spaces. What is this key idea that we want from our good embedding space? So the idea is that semantically sort of similar concepts or like semantic concepts where instances of same semantic concepts should actually be clustered together in the embedding space. That's some key idea that we want from our good embedding space. And what that basically means is if it's an image classification, we want images belonging to the same concept, clustering together in the embedding space. If it's semantic segmentation, I don't know, maybe some kind of patches with certain semantic properties, we want them to sort of different sizes, patches of different sizes, essentially. We want them to sort of be clustered together in the embedding space and stuff like that. So this kind of there comes the idea of contrastive learning, where we actually directly try to do this thing without designing such unrelated or related, but we cannot really explain the relation, some related pretext tasks essentially. So the idea is that positive pairs. So the idea of positive pairs is instances that belong to the same semantic concept. They will attract each other. And this cluster that we will form with this same these instances of the same concept, they're going to have very little intra-cluster variance. So we are basically we'll try to group them together. And the negative pairs, which is if the instances are from different semantic concepts, then they should repel each other and they should be far away from each other. So in an ideal, let's say the downstream task is image classification, then the ideal situation is where we have maximum inter-cluster variance. So the clusters are like far away from each other as much as possible, and the clusters themselves are sort of they're almost minimizing to vanishing to one particular point. They're very tightly packed. So that is the ideal case. And contrastive learning essentially tries to do that to some extent directly. So this is a famous work that I previously talked about, Sinclair. And this is actually not the first contrastive learning paper. There were actually multiple papers that came out before it, but this is actually one of the simplest algorithms, and it's actually one of the most popular ones. So the idea is that, well, in a situation where we don't have access to labels, then we don't really know what a positive pair is, because given two images, since we don't have labels, we don't know if they're the images of dogs or something else. So the idea is that we are going to create two different augmentations of the same image and say that if two augmented images come from the same image, they are the positive pairs. And if two augmented images, they come from two different images, source images, they are actually negative pairs. So we are going to create augmentations from the same image, and we are going to attract them. And if the augmentations come from different images, augmented images come from different images, we are going to sort of maximize the minimize the similarity or maximize the distance in the embedding space. And so why that works? My hypothesis is that it works because of how ImageNet is. So ImageNet is not a very highly imbalanced data set. So if you, for a given particular, so ImageNet is not a highly imbalanced data set, and it also has lots and lots of classes. So given a particular batch, if you sample two images, it's very likely that they are going to belong to sort of two different semantic concepts. And also, I think as long as you are minimizing the distance between the similarities of minimizing the distance between two semantically related concepts more than you are minimizing the distance between the two instances from different images, this algorithm is probably going to work. And also getting such instances where, well, let's say you have sampled one image of a dog, another image of a dog here, and sort of trying to repel these representations, that is actually very less likely. So as long as it's less likely, those cases are very rare, and most cases are actually where these two source images they belong to different semantic concepts. They are as long as they are more predominant, algorithm is going to work really well. And actually that is what's happening, and that is how SimScaler works, and it does a pretty good job. So another concept is that we do not do explicit minimization of similarity for negative pairs. What we do is explicit maximization of similarity between positive pairs, but we have a constrained in a constrained setting. So if in order to maximize the similarity between positive pairs, you end up minimizing the dissimilarity. End up minimizing the similarity between negative pairs. So the reason for that is because so these are all the similarity, or in some sense inverse distances between the representations. And for the positive example, we are going to maximize the similarity. And since it's a softmax function, so which is a normalized function, if you want to maximize the similarity of the positive pair, you will have to minimize the similarity of the other pairs, because the sum essentially is one of the probability distribution. So this part is being done implicitly, and this part is being done explicitly. So yeah, that is basically the idea of SimCLR. And yeah, like I said, it's actually one of the first papers which is actually catching up with supervised learning. So one of the limitations of SimCLR is that, well, we need negative pairs, and even if we mine negative pairs, then actually, so okay. So why do we need negative pairs? So the reason for negative pairs is that if we just attracted semantically related concepts, then the neural network can actually hack the system, which basically means it can map everything to one particular sort of data point in the embedding space, and have, for example, could be that if it maps everything to the zero vector, and we have minimized the loss function, and all our constraints are satisfied, and that is completely useful. So there are these kind of situations where the neural network learns a trick to sort of minimize it to one particular vector is called collapse of the embedding space, and we want to avoid collapse. So that's why we want to make sure that they are actually, so different semantic concepts are actually spread out all over the embedding space, and our negative repelling actually helps that. So that's why we read negative pairs, because in the absence of negative pairs, we are actually going to collapse the embedding space. Another actually sort of limitation of SimClear is that it's not really computationally, or in terms of data, it's not really that efficient, because it actually requires large batch sizes, and batch sizes like up to 4K, and it also takes lots and lots of epochs to learn, like I think somewhere between 300 to 2000 epochs, I can't remember, but it takes a lot of time, and it requires a lot of GPU power to sort of train these kind of algorithms. So it's not that any person can randomly open up a GPU and just try and build some kind of algorithms like this. So that's a limitation. So, but the second question is that do we even need negative pairs? Like can we actually build a sort of self-supervised learning algorithm where the idea of negative, we don't really have to do negative mining, because if you do negative mining, then it comes with its own set of problems, like which negatives are we going to take? There is the idea of curriculum learning, which start with like easy negatives and then move on to hard negatives, and so on. We have to do a lot of engineering over there. So if you can get rid of this sort of negative mining component of self-supervised learning or contrastive learning, then that's going to be really helpful. And but we have to make sure that we don't collapse the embedding space. So we have to get rid of negative pairs while not collapsing the embedding space, which is really a hard problem. So again, another paper which came out from Google last year is BYOL, which is bootstrap your own latent, which actually doesn't require negative mining. And one of the reason why this paper is interesting is because I don't think this paper is really explained. It's really explained why this algorithm works, and in fact, explanation of this algorithm in itself is its own area of research. I think there is a paper that came out a week back from Facebook AI Research which tries to do that, but I haven't read that paper, so unfortunately I don't know what that paper is talking about. But it's actually, I will explain why this algorithm is actually very counterintuitive, and it doesn't really make sense why this algorithm works. But it works really well, and it works better than SimClear. So the idea is that we're going to have two networks. So this is, and these networks are more or less similar, except for here we have a prediction subnetwork, and here we don't. This second network, we're going to call that a target network, because we are not going to back propagate through this particular network. So there's a stop gradient operation, which basically means gradients don't flow back from this particular point. And there's an online network, which is essentially will try to predict the values, or basically it will try to predict the probability distribution that is being predicted from the target network. And so once we do that, we are actually going to backpropagate through this section and learn the parameters for this particular network. But for this part, for the second network, which is the target network, instead of backpropagating, what we are going to do is we are going to have an exponential moving average of all the parameters present in the first network. So initially, maybe some random initialization, and then we do a running average we do backpropagation for this part. We take a running average and copy it to the second network. Again, we do prediction. We again do backpropagation. Again, for the new parameters, we take in again sort of do a running average and copy it to the second network. And this process continues until we're sort of done. And this works really well. So and one thing is that this running average is we actually use exponential moving average because we don't really want to sort of fluctuate these parameters, and hence the prediction of this particular network a lot. Because if it fluctuates a lot, then the neural network doesn't really know what to predict, because for the same image it predicts some the probability distribution at one time step is something, and for the next time step it will be something else. So we want to very slowly update the parameters of this second network, and we do that with exponential moving average. And yeah, so this is how essentially this algorithm works. So how do we prevent collapse in this particular setting? Well, that is the thing that is unexplained as of now, or at least I am not aware of it. So I don't really have the answer. But it doesn't, for some reason, prevent the collapse. And it also works really well. It works better than SimClear. Why it works better than SimClear, I don't know. But the motivation behind this, it's not that people started experimenting and just came up with this algorithm. They actually saw some observations, and they actually carried forward from those observations and built this algorithm. And the observation, which is itself very counterintuitive, which is, so for ImageNet, what the authors did is they first built a random sort of coordinate backbone, which is randomly initialized. And then they fit from the representations of this randomly initialized coordinate backbone, they fit on top of that, they essentially fit a linear classifier like SVM, and tried to get some numbers for the ImageNet dataset, and they got 1.4% top one accuracy. Top one essentially means that, well, it's just the accuracy that we are used to seeing, like getting yeah. So now the thing is that now we have this fixed randomly initialized network. If we have another network where we try to predict the probability distribution of this first network, and then use this and basically do backpropagation, and then use this new network that was trained to predict the values of this first network, and then fit a linear classifier on top of that, we actually get 18.8%. So there's a huge jump from 1.4% to 18.8%. Why this works? Again, it's very counterintuitive. I don't know why that works, but it works. And once they had this observation, what they did is they suggested that we can actually do this process iteratively and sort of increase the numbers at every iteration, and try to see how far this goes. And it really works really well, because for SimClear we had over here, and now BYOL, Bootstrap Your Own Latent, is now outperforming SimClear and a bunch of other papers, and it's very close to supervised learning algorithms. So yeah, so in practice it works really well. So there are actually a lot of other research directions that actually came up in between. They were sort of based on deep clustering and all of that. And for the interest of time, actually, I'm going to skip all of that. Instead, I'm going to go into the state-of-the-art approach in this particular domain, which actually uses visual transformers. So the idea is that the idea of visual transformer is that transformers first came up in NLP, and then the vision community adapted that from the NLP community. And the idea is that instead of using CNNs or coordinates, what we are going to do is we are going to process an image as a sequence of patches. So we are going to, an image is defined as a sequence of patches. And what is the sequence? So we can actually define our own sequencing. We can use row major indexing, like we can call it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and so on. And we are going to basically patchify the image, and then have these indices, have a corresponding representation for these indices that is called positional encoding. And we have a transformer that is very similar to an NLP transformer, where we have self-attention and all these mechanisms. And we are basically going to run a representation from this visual transformer. And the idea is you can think of it as a alternative to having a coordinate backbone. Now, for some reason, visual transformer doesn't really work well with these existing self-supervised learning algorithms, but it works really well with this particular algorithm called Dino. This is actually very similar to the last algorithm that I talked about, but it actually explicitly prevents this collapse. So the idea is that, so here we call it student and teacher, whereas in the other algorithm we called it online and target networks. But essentially the idea is still the same, where we are going to basically backpropagate on one of the networks, and we're going to keep computing this running average and essentially copy these parameters to the second network. And this network doesn't have backpropagation because we have a stop gradient operations. The gradients cannot flow beyond this particular point. And we're also going to use this negative log likelihood to predict the probabilities of the second network in the first network. So it's essentially, to some extent, it's very similar to BYOL, but some of the two key contributions is that, they have a centering and a sharpening operation. So if you think about it, when collapse happens in the embedding space, we essentially, what that means is your network is trying to predict one representation again and again and again. So that basically means maybe it really likes to predict the representation for a canonical representation for a bird. And no matter what image you give, it is trying to predict the representation of some bird. That's basically an example of collapse. And if you think about it, that basically means in the probability distribution space, for the normalized probabilities after softmax, that basically means that one probability is always very high. So if you take the average of all the probabilities, you will have a very high mean score for that particular probability for which the collapse is happening. Now, if you actually keep a track of this average, and when you get a new probability distribution, you subtract this average, then essentially you are actually subtracting a high value for the semantic concept where which you are predicting more often, which are sort of, which is basically causing the collapse. And we are subtracting a low value because we are actually going to have a very low mean score for these other classes or semantic concepts that don't occur that often. So essentially, we are trying to suppress the probability of that class we are very likely to predict, and sort of enhance the probabilities of these other classes which we are sort of missing out more often. So that is centering operation, and it is passed before softmax, and that kind of helps us to prevent these collapse where we are trying to predict the same representation again and again. But if we just do centering, that leads to a unique kind of collapse, which is where we end up predicting all the we end up predicting a uniform distribution all the time, where all the classes are equally likely. And in terms of representation space, what happens is that we end up predicting a particular vector, or end up mapping every single image to a vector that is sort of equidistant from all the cluster centroids. And that's also one kind of collapse, because you're still trying to predict one particular value, or map everything to one particular representation. So in order to prevent that from happening, we use something called sharpening, which is essentially temperature scaling, where by temperature scaling, what we do is we essentially given if the probabilities are a little bit dissimilar, we try to enhance the probabilities. If there's a little bit of difference between two probabilities, we are going to decrease the smaller one by a lot and increase the larger one by a lot. So that's why we don't really end up sort of getting into the center of all these different clusters. So that is the centering and sharpening operation. And with these two operations, they saw that they were able to prevent collapse really well. And this is actually, well, as of when this paper got released, this was the state of the art. If you look at it, we are actually very, very close to catching up with supervised. So supervised, we had 79.3 with the linear classifier, and this is SimClear, which is 69.1 with resonant 50 backbone. And we have been actually, some of the algorithms I've skipped for the interest of time, but we have been making a lot of progress. And it's only been, in January 2020, this paper came out. So it's only been a year and a half. Well, technically a year, because this came out earlier this year. So we have made a ton of progress, and we are sort of actually catching up. So if you use a visual transformer backbone, then we actually have 77 as our linear classifier upon accuracy. So we are very close to catching up with the supervised learning algorithms. So this is essentially a table that summarizes the current performance of all these methods. So this is where I more or less end the presentation. I wanted to keep it within 45 minutes. So summary, so the entire idea behind this presentation was that I wanted to sort of, in a very short, concise manner, I wanted to present the key ideas of self-supervised learning. So what is self-supervised learning? What are some of the scope? And to also motivate the audience to understand that this is a really hot topic in research as well as in the industry. In fact, a lot of my other work that I do in the industry is heavily, and other people do in this industry, is heavily relied on top of self-supervised learning and supervised learning algorithms, because there is a lot of annotation scarcity in the world. So it's not a deep learning. Supervised learning is not a practical solution if you're thinking about scalability. We have discussed some of the what are some of the terminologies and key terms and some of the basic concepts, and what is the evaluation protocol for all these things. And I also wanted to cover the timeline of these ideas. So essentially how these ideas have evolved over time, and what is some of these direction that we are headed towards, and some of these key milestone research directions. Unfortunately, some of them are unexplained, but that is how deep learning works. We first invent something, and then later on try to explain it. I'm pretty sure they will be explained in the next few years. Some of the future directions, I haven't included some of the newer papers like instance localization and all of that. Part of the reason is because I wanted to sort of have some coherence between the concepts that I wanted to discuss. But what we are starting to see is that some algorithms that really work well for other downstream tasks like object detection and semantic segmentation, they don't really work well for classification. And classification is one of actually the easiest easiest tasks for computer vision relative to object detection and semantic segmentation and all of that, because it is not really concerned with localization. For classification, we have a bunch of algorithms, but for we are starting to build algorithms for other downstream tasks like segmentation and object detection. But what we are saying is that if we try to sort of optimize for one, we don't really end up optimizing for the other. So we are yet to build algorithms that really transfer well to multiple downstream tasks or more or less equally. So that's an active direction. Another thing is currently self-supervised learning is only limited to pre-training. And that is unfortunately the only application probably out there, or at least the application that I'm aware of. And we would like to actually move on from pre-training to other different kinds of applications and make self-supervised learning even more useful. The third thing is that it is not really efficient in terms of data and compute. And the reason for that is it requires really a lot of unannotated data to sort of learn these representations. And it's also in terms of computation, it's also very expensive because we have to train for really, really long time. We have to train for like thousands of epochs, and we really need large batch sizes. So we have to sort of train across multiple clusters of GPUs and all of that. And and another active sort of a very new research direction in this domain of learning with less data and all of that is actually moving beyond SSL. So these ideas are relatively newer. These are something to do with causality, which is inspired from basically trying to build modular representations. Some of these works are along the lines of neurosymbolic AI or causal representations and all of that, which is again a bit out of scope for this discussion. But yeah, so that is the current state of self-supervised learning, and that is the end of my presentation. So yeah. That's it. Thank you. I guess I can take some questions.
Thank you, Satyaki. Very nicely explained. So let me open this for the questions. So if you have any questions, you can actually post it in the chat box. And we can discuss that.
So thank you, Satyaki, for this wonderful presentation. And yeah, your presentation skill is really, awesome. So I have one small question in mind, which may not be exactly on the topic that you were stating, like something like your view on non-image data. For example, for the sensor data, like smartphone sensing, there are many works going on based on smartphone sensing. And there, if you don't have that kind of image or video, then it really becomes, very difficult to annotate those data sufficient and to gather the sufficient amount of annotated data for deep learning. It's almost an infeasible task for like our students, or in the setup that we work at Jadavpur University and somewhere else as well. So what is your take on this self-supervised learning or causality you have mentioned probably? So what is your take on that?
Yeah, so actually that's a very important, good point actually. So the thing is that the reason why annotating for vision tasks is easier is because you can actually see what you're annotating. But sometimes if you're talking about sensors, then there are lots of sensors that are sort of measuring physical properties, like, I don't know, I'm guessing you're talking about different kinds of sensors that are present in the mobile phone, like IMU and all those things. So annotating those things are extremely challenging. So there are actually different ways. So self-supervised learning is definitely important in that prospect. So again, I personally don't know, what kind of tasks or what kind of discrete test tasks or what kind of contrastive learning algorithms are going to work in those particular settings, because sometimes I feel like there are actually a lot of small details that are sort of left out in these publications. And an example for image is that the reason why you can sort of group different images together from ImageNet is because there's always a lot of statistical bias in the data we collect. For example, if you look at ImageNet, or even if we look at like all these photos that we collect in the real world, we always, let's say we're taking a picture of our dog, then we actually going to zoom in and center the dog, or like make sure that the dog occupies the most of the image and all of these things. So there are these sort of trivial things that we human beings sort of take for granted, but that actually makes our algorithm work really well. Because let's say now if we take like all these images of birds and all these images of dogs in ImageNet, and let's say we increase the context where, let's say, the dog is in a road and it's occupying a really tiny portion of the image, then none of these algorithms are going to work, because where is the dog? There are so many different kind of concepts present in that image. So that is actually one of these sort of statistical bias that is present in our data set that we really sort of take for granted, but actually makes the vision task easier. Now, the thing is, for this particular set of problems, for non-vision tasks, or these other kinds of sensory input, then we have to find these kind of statistical biases that we can take advantage of. That's one thing. There is another line of sort of self-supervised learning, which is related to consistency. So we have to take advantage of consistency. So and this consistency is also very domain dependent. For example, let's say you want to learn self-supervised learning for videos. So one of the consistency is that if you take a patch and if you forward propagate the patch through time in a video, and you propagate it backwards, then that particular patch should, no matter what part it takes, it's going to come back to the same initial position. So this is a consistency we just exploited. So there are lots of cyclic consistencies that are present in the world, and we need to find those consistencies, and these are actually going to act as constraints for the self-supervised learning algorithms for the different domains. It's just that these are going to be very domain specific.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from Professor Ram Sharkar. So do you see the questions coming below? So how is it different from GAN, GAN, and how to create embedding space? Isn't it very much problem dependent? So this is the first question.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer to the first problem is that, well, how is it different from GAN? So GAN is an algorithm, and self-supervised learning is it's a problem. So you can use GAN to actually learn representations for self-supervised learning, as long as these constraints are satisfied, where you are sort of not using any labels, or you are sort of using the input data in some sort of supervision. So you can actually, in some sense, there are actually lots of GANs that people use to actually, I might have even mentioned them. Anyway, so you can use actually GANs to build self-supervised learning algorithms is the answer. It's not different from GAN. The thing is that GAN is a possible solution for this kind of algorithms. So this is more like a paradigm, and whereas GAN is an algorithm. That's the relation. How to create embedding space, isn't it very much? Yes, it is very much problem dependent. So again, we are in the very early stages of doing self-supervised learning. So we are still making improvements for image classification, which is one of the most basic tasks. In the ideal case, we are going to have this, hypothetically ideal case, we are going to have this embedding space, which is sort of general, that generalizes well across all possible tasks. That is the goal, but we are not there yet. So right now, we would like to do that, but we are not being able to do that, is the answer. Right now, it is problem dependent, yeah.
Okay, so there is another question that is context encoding. Can we apply it for identifying occluded objects?
Yeah,
like guessing the face of a person wearing a mask. This is a very interesting.
That's a good question. So if you think about it, that is exactly what context encoding does. So basically, we are going to hide a portion of the image, and we are going to learn, make our algorithms, learn to predict this, hidden out portion. And if we are talking about, hiding the face with a mask, then that basically means that we are trying to learn these facial. We are basically, maybe given the top half of the face, we are trying to predict the bottom half. So that basically makes the neural network learn some representations with respect to the facial structures and all of that. So that might end up being a useful pretext task for face recognition and all these things. So it's an interesting idea for that perspective.
So the third question is Boyle. So don't you think it's almost like supervised learning as you are using a target?
Okay, this is something that I don't fully understand. So why is using a target? So it is not supervised learning because we don't really have labels at any point. Yeah, and in self-supervised learning, the idea is that you are going to always have some targets. Even if we think about some algorithm like rotation prediction, the angle of rotation is our target, but it is a proxy target. We don't have the actual target because we don't have labels, but we use these proxy targets and use these ideas of supervised learning with these proxy targets to learn representations, because these ideas for supervised learning like backpropagation and gradient descent, they actually work really well, and you can sort of do a lot of optimizations for that, and we still want to do that. So there are lots of similarities. That's why it's called self-supervised. But we don't really have an actual label. We don't know, what is the corresponding label for a particular data point. We create these artificial proxy labels. And in the case of BIOL, we have basically the target probabilities as the proxy labels. And these target probabilities are not really learned from from a label data. So they are just randomly initialized, and we iteratively improve from them. So at no point we're using label data. So that's why it's not supervised. Yeah.
Okay, so I hope this answers those questions. So if you have any other questions, please type in the chat box. So I have a couple of small questions. As you mentioned in Boyle, so if I understand correctly, so it does not use any negative set, right? So
yeah.
So this is really an interesting situation. So in constructive learning, so you said like you are constructing the positives, but the negatives relations are just random, right? So if you, and you also said like in case of there may be some problems when you have like two images of a dog. So so that may be a improper or poor quality negative example.
Yeah.
So in many domains, like people actively work on the negative sets, right? So generation of quality negative data preparation itself is a big research problem in many domains, especially say in biology and also. What is your take on that? So one side, you are saying that Boyle is almost reaching the best standards, but creating good quality negatives also.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So this is actually the motivation for Boyle. That, like you said, negative mining is actually it's in itself is a huge field, not particularly for contrastive learning or anything like that. In general, like even for object detection. So one of these papers called RetinaNet, which essentially uses some algorithm called focal loss, which is essentially a very general version of negative mining. So it's like basically a soft negative mining, essentially, to some extent. So negative mining is used everywhere, all over machine learning, and it has its own subfields, which are it's in itself very huge. Like curriculum learning, we start with easy negatives, and we train on those easy negatives, and then we actually build increase the complexity of these negatives. So slowly that way the neural network can sort of take care of harder tasks at an incremental level and sort of build better representations. But the thing is that then we are sort of then what we are doing is we actually have to rely on a lot of engineering. And the thing about deep learning is that we would like to engineer as little as possible and be actually very lazy in that sense, that we are going to just see some constraints from the data, or I don't know, in the domain, and we are going to capitalize as much as possible on those things and learn directly from the data. That's basically how I see the sort of the principle of deep learning is. So if we keep on engineering, then there is no end of engineering, right? We can engineer more and more and more, and then also we might also over-engineer for some particular tasks or particular data sets and end up with overfitting and all of that. So there are these problems, and yeah, so that's the idea of artificial intelligence, right? We don't want to do the work for the algorithm there. We want the algorithm to figure out everything on its own with minimal amount of constraints that we want to provide. So that's the idea behind why BIOL was sort of motivated that we don't really want to engineer negative mining. And why it works again, I don't know. There's a recent paper that came out. I'm happy to share the link. It's very mathematical. I haven't read it. I think it's going to be hard to understand. But yeah, it came out from Facebook AI Research, I think a week back, that sort of explains why non-contrastive learning algorithms work and why we don't run into this collapse problem. But yeah, as an individual, it's very hard for me to explain right now.
Okay, so you have another question from Professor Sharkar. So I think this is a follow-up of your answer to that Boyle question. So
yeah,
you said about some.
Yeah, so yes, these metrics are quantifiable. So the thing is that that's why I actually wanted to discuss. I discussed the evaluation protocols in the beginning. So what that means is, if we talk about how good your representation is, then it's a qualitative thing. Then you won't be able to apply quantitative metrics to that. But if you use these evaluation protocols, then you can actually use quantifiable metrics. So all these graphs that you have seen, they're essentially top one accuracy of the self-supervised learning algorithm, which essentially means that you train the representations using self-supervised learning, and then you fit a linear classifier like an SVM on top of these representations, or the backbone that generates representations, and then you sort of quantify on these the predictions of these backbone plus SVM, or backbone plus linear classifier. And the reason you want a linear classifier is because you don't want the classifier to have nonlinearities, because if you have nonlinearities, then you are going to learn representations inside the classifier itself. So you want to make the classifier do minimal amount of work on top of the representations, and you are going to use the performance of this sort of coordinate or this backbone plus classifier to understand how good this coordinate was generating representations. Yeah. So these are quantifiable metrics. This is top one accuracy on ImageNet.
Okay. Any further questions? Chandra, you have any other questions? I can have one last comment or question. Maybe I was curious to ask another question.
Sure.
So you said like future of ML is unsupervised. So
I didn't say that. It's
you mentioned that, right?
Yeah.
And you also said like, okay, it takes 1.5 hours for a single annotation, and also there are startups coming up. So I know you have entrepreneurial mindset. You had those ideas. So what is your take on this? Like, in one side, you are reaching supervised learning performance with an unsupervised thing, and also you have the startups coming up who are trying to cash in on this requirement. So what is your comment on that?
Yeah, so that's actually a good question. So I think that's what good startups do. Good startups essentially try to find these sort of loopholes in the system or in the current technology that that are unexploited, and try to capitalize on that. Part of the reason is because the major concerns are always kind of going to be addressed by big tech companies such as Google, Apple, Amazon, and so on. And so you should have this sort of this keen interest for building startups. I think you should always be aware of what are these sort of areas where people are not targeting. Maybe it's too small for them, or maybe they're too busy doing some more difficult stuff. So you go there and you try to create a product market fit and do all of that. And these startups did that. And the thing is, I personally don't know. These are actually built by really smart people, and they are heavily invested by investors in Silicon Valley, like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. And the thing is that I personally, as an individual, don't really have much to say on the fate of these startups. The thing is that I don't know if, as an individual, especially as someone who's not that experienced, I don't know what's going to happen 10 years down the line. But the thing about deep learning is that deep learning has attracted too much talent in the last 10 years, and we have seen immense progress in deep learning, and to some extent that it has become extremely competitive to publish papers and all of that. And it is only going to get more and more competitive until we hit the next AI winter, I think. So I don't know, maybe in the next 10-20 years, we are actually going to have self-supervised learning algorithms that are going to outperform supervised, and we don't need annotation. We're still going to need annotations because we need to do evaluation, right? So we need quantitative metrics to do evaluation. So from that perspective, and the larger the test set is, the more general understanding we'll have of our understanding of our algorithms. So we still need annotations. It's not going to be gone completely, but like the burden obviously is going to be lessened. And the other thing is that data is not just annotations. There's actually multiple sets. So there's a lot of work that goes into sort of database management and all of that. That is also like handling data to some sense, and these inputs. And the thing is that the volume of data is only going to increase over time. So maybe instead of focusing on annotation, they are going to focus on how to do efficient storage and all of that, and how to maybe do better data compression and all of that. So they are going to pivot eventually if self-supervised learning takes off to the way we are thinking it will take off. But the data will always be there, because all these algorithms are data-driven approaches. Deep learning is data-driven essentially. So the requirement of handling data and taking care of data pipelines is always going to be there, even though if the burden for data annotation is going to decrease. That's my take. Yeah. You're muted, ma'am.
Chandra,
yeah. Nowadays, most of the deep learning networks that are available today, and then the self-supervised learning that you are talking about, it all requires GPUs and very expensive machinery, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is it like learning is a thing for which GPUs and clusters of GPUs is a necessity to navigate? And on the other hand, we can see that there is another direction that is going on for edge and also on device learning. People are also talking about that. So where these two will converge? I mean, what is your prediction on it?
Right. So that's a good question, and to some extent, I'm also involved with those efforts right now in my job. The best solution right now that exists is that during training time, we are going to take advantage of these large GPU clusters and all of that, and that's where these big tech companies, with all their funding and all their resources, they actually have an edge over smaller companies or individuals, or to some extent even labs, research labs. And that's why they do have this edge, and that's why a lot of these great publications come from the mostly from the industry for some reason, like research labs in industry, because of this edge, because it's the same people who are at some point in the academia. Now they're at some other place. Now they're able to do all this research because they have the scale has increased to a great extent. In fact, a lot of people have mentioned this. The idea is that you're going to use all these resources during training time, and then the thing is that the main challenge for in practical situations is not the training part, because you do it in-house. The problem is inference. Now, if you require a GPU for inference of your model, is really sort of huge in terms of to fit in the mobile memory, or I don't know, even for all these edge devices and all of that, then it's not really helpful. So that actually creates its own branch of study, which is basically doing something like model compression, or there are lots of ways to do is there are these ideas of like pruning the network, getting rid of these units that are no longer. So you start with a large model, you train it, and then you start pruning these units one by one until you have to keep all these essential units. That's one way. Then there is the idea of knowledge distillation, where you sort of start with a large network and you train it properly, get all the information that you want in that large network, and then you basically distill the knowledge from this large network into a smaller network. That is much more, that's much better in terms of performance, rather than starting with the small network and training that small network. It's also a paper by Jeffrey Hinton, I think. The people have done a lot of work on sort of minimizing this burden during inference time, because a lot of these things that we see, like for example Alexa on AI that learns Alexa, these are small devices with very little compute and all of that, though, but like they are trained on a lot of data, so they start with really
so ultimately at some point of time you need, sorry to interrupt, ultimately at some point of time you need that big data clusters in order to analyze, and then you are
so that's the current way of doing it. In future, I don't know, maybe we will invent methods where we can actually start with small algorithms, and we'll have to sort of that's I don't know about that, what's going to happen in the future, but right now at least that's what we do. We start with large models and then we slowly make small models out of these large models. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't see any further questions, so we can go to the next phase. Maybe Chandri, if you can go to a more casual discussion, non-technical discussion.
Yeah. That's good.
No, like first of all, we have many students who are watching and will be watching this video, and as you know that online teaching and learning is taking place nowadays, so many of them even have very poor internet connectivity. So the kind of sharing that used to happen when the campus was open is not the same thing here, particularly in the Indian scenario. So in that case, like what will be your can you give some suggestions like how students will prepare for example, you got SN Bose fellowship, and there are many other scholarships as well, like DAD and other students. So how a student would prepare for that, and yeah, what is your take on it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know, maybe it's a personality thing, but like I usually don't keep some a particular a goal in mind when I try for I had tried for these things. So when I had applied for SN Bose, I didn't really like. I was like, I will do this kind of internship because in the long term I would like to do such things. And I know SN Bose or getting this internship would really help me when I applied to CMU, and that's what I just wanted to do that. That's why I applied. Like, it's not that I had to do it. So, and also when I applied for SN Bose, I didn't really care much about like getting the scholarship. Like, it's prestigious, obviously. I'm not downplaying it, but like I didn't really. It wouldn't have really mattered for me because I would have gone anyway, whether I got scholarship or not. And the thing is, when the thing is that if we try to sort of take care at the high level, like what is this thing that I want to do, and we can sort of align this sort of our interests or our background with these sort of requirements what the SN Bose is looking for, then actually that makes a much better, stronger purpose and a better sort of maybe an application in some sense than just like trying to see what other people have done for SN Bose and trying to fit those gaps. And for me, what I had done is I in my sophomore year I actually. Well, based on actually, I learned this from my seniors. Actually, we were sort of discussing all these things, and I suddenly took an interest. Before that, I was into competitive programming, but then in my sophomore year, I decided that I'm going to explore this machine learning, ideas a lot. They seem really intriguing, and I started doing courses, and I started, and then I also got into, and everything is like an incremental thing. So SN Base didn't really happen overnight for me. And also, I was not the topper in my class, so that was already a limitation I had. So what for me in my sophomore year, I started doing all these things. I was doing a lot of things just out for fun, not because I sort of wanted to put them on a resume. I was just exploring stuff, and then that led to something which is I got a robotics internship at Google Summer of Code in 2015. I worked with a professor there as well. Eventually, that project was successful. We got a publication, and I also got a recommendation from him. So that's one of the first criteria that is getting sort of filled up for SN Bose, which is a strong recommendation. And he was also a famous robotics professor, so that helped. And then for SN Bose, I was not really looking for internships just to go to a good school and do a research internship. I was like more interested in doing a particular thing. At that point, I was very much into drones and all of that, and I wanted to, it's very expensive to buy drones in India, but like there are lots of labs in the US where they have lots of spare drones and all of that. So there was this particular lab in CMU which I had applied to, and I had the necessary knowledge at least to do an internship. So I applied to a program called it's called RISS, and then eventually led to selection. I ended up working in this lab. And once I got selected, SN Bose saw that, and probably they saw that this person is already going, and might as well then might just fund them, because they already have an offer. So these things, I think, when we I think if we target things competitive, especially because the amount of competition that is already there in the world of technology, that's going to only create anxiety, I think, because that's because a lot of people and other people are really smart. I mean, it's not that other people are not smart. So you are going to compete with smart people to get things. And so if you are sort of focusing on the output metrics, then that makes things difficult, and also comes with a lot of despair if you don't for some reason make it and someone else makes it. It comes with all this I don't know, inferiority complex and all of that. So I think these competitive things, for me at least, they are sort of an effect of small steps that I had taken through over a long period of time. That's how I see it. So that's how I think how I got the SNBOs, and that's how I think maybe is a good way to do SNBOs. Yeah, because if you're not interested in, let's say, you're interested in, let's say, getting a job after a bachelor's, then SNBOs is completely meaningless. If you want, you show that to your employer, and like, okay, great, now can you sort of build this algorithm or write this distributed system. So everything is very much dependent on the what you want to do in the long term. I think it's sort of at a high level, it's important to understand what you want to do with yourself. But at a high level, because the low level details are never going to work out because there is too many stochastic factors. Yeah.
Actually, very few students at that age can understand that what are their high level goal.
Well, you never
That
understand. You just go with the flow. You just just keep running, and then you get hit. You get hit. That's it.
Going with the flow is often, that becomes counterproductive. I have met many students who actually went with the flow and found that whatever job they have landed with, and that initially that sounded really nice, but they quickly got dissatisfied, and that actually cost a couple of years. So until you realize that it's not the right fit for you. So what is your take on that? At the level of the students, you have a peer pressure, right? So everyone is going for the jobs, and
and the pay package, and probably there are family and societal expectations as well.
Yeah.
So they don't really understand what they want or what they are fit for. Very few student at that age can have, can figure it out. That is very important. So, yeah,
I would say that it's important to some extent. I think there are the effect of stochastic external factors, which is luck essentially. But I think I don't know. Maybe in this prospect, the personality and the mindset of the person matters. For me, I really care about what other people thought of me. That's especially when I was in college. There were times where I really failed interviews, like at jobs, and at some point, especially during my freshman year, I'd like to think I used to do a lot of competitive programming, and I had a lot of seniors like Afif and all, like there are lots of seniors I can mention. Like they actually I learned from them, and maybe if I had carried on that sort of this competitive programming sort of skill set, then I would have done something else. But I know there is always bias in the society. So society usually tries to sort of focus on these output goals, like sort of at which age you are starting working. So some extent, like that's also sort of that's also one of the reasons why a lot of people don't take a PhD, because they just want to start earning from a very early age, and they kind of get stuck in the local minima, like you said, sir. And so I don't know much about that. Like I am myself very inexperienced. But what I think is that it's very important to sort of not care about what other people think and try to find out interest. In fact, for me, it's not that I was just like born like this. I saw my seniors who and some of these my brilliant seniors, especially from our department, and I can name 10 people right now. They are actually the people who are really good at what they are doing. Were actually genuinely interested in what they're doing. So, like example would be Afifza and Digvijayda, like 2 or 4 years senior to me. They were like really good coders, and they genuinely cared about that, and that's why. And they're not like bothered about which company is giving them how much offer. They just and the thing is, since they have the interest and the genuine knack for being a good engineer, they were they had this ball in their court. So when they get offers, they can get multiple offers. They can negotiate and increase their salary. So so if we sort of not focus on output metrics, so these things help. There are people like Bishwadip, like he did science club and all of that. He was very interested in embedded systems and all of that, and he still is, and I'm still in touch with him. And so and these people sort of inspired me to see, like if I do something, I'd rather be just good at it, and instead of like focusing on like additions, output metrics, and I was less worried about what other people thought and what society thought. And I think that's very important, especially given the bias that we have in our society. That's my take. That's my mindset. I don't know if it's gonna work for everyone, but yeah. Application.
We have another question actually, so if we can.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the thing is, not just big tech companies, but the volume of data is always increasing, and you always have to sort of actually, that's a very good question, because it actually talks about multiple sub problems in deep learning. So one of them is distribution shift. So let's say you start with a small data set. Your mean and variance for the data set is less. So the statistical properties for that data distribution is something. And let's say you are going to add more and more data set. There's going to have a distribution shift, which basically means at a low level, that means that the mean and variance are going to shift and so on. So that's the problem of distribution shift. Then the thing is, what happens when you have the settings of the deep learning actually change, which is let's say you have a certain set of classes. You started with 2 classes, and now there are 3 classes, 4 classes, or let's say now you started with 1 class, like classification. Now you have to do classification and segmentation and all that. So all these actually are related problems, and that the field is called continual learning. And the way we do it is we don't want to train and again because that is very redundant. What we do is given that we have already trained on a previous stage or a previous state. Now that we have the next state, what we would like to do is we would actually want to. So if we learn from the beginning, the result is what happens is that we can end up with catastrophic forgetting, which is we might forget all the things that we have learned, and a lot of these things that we had learned earlier might be useful, which we are getting rid of. So we do some kind of regularizations, like that are at the model level or at the prediction level, and essentially some constraints which prevents us from forgetting what we had learned, and also helps us learn these new concepts or adapt to distribution shift and all of that. So that's called continual learning.
Okay, so that's a good question. So anything else? So everything is getting normal in your end. So I think we already have a 1 hour 40-minute session. So I think in the morning, I think it is really, it was a barley for us, and I could hear the morning alarm as well.
Yeah. It's not used to waking up this early, but yeah, I should change habits. Yeah.
Okay, so anything else, Chandri, and any other questions from the audience?
No. So I think it's already 9:42.
So if not, so I have a small presentation. Like everything is digital these days. So unfortunately, we have only have a digital token of appreciation for you. Just a second. Let me share my screen. So on behalf of I hope this is visible. So on behalf of the computer chapter of IEEE Kolkata section, my heartiest thanks to Satyaki for taking time out for this wonderful lecture. Really wonderful lecture. We all learned a lot of things. So thank you very much, Satyaki. You actually, I pinged him in the LinkedIn, and he immediately agreed and shared his topic. So thank you very much, Satyaki.
And students also requested. Now student chapters requested for. They were
when
interested.
I discussed, so they were really happy to have you. Like they were extremely delighted to have you as a presenter. So this is number 2 in our series. First one was Jishnu. I think you know Jishnu.
Yeah, Jishnu is doing great stuff. I mean, he actually, I think, working on things that are way more complicated than what I do. I mean, he's doing a PhD right now, so I don't even want to imagine how hard things can get over there. So yeah.
He's
So
your
really
senior.
good.
Yeah, he's 1 year
Your
senior to me. Yeah.
1 year
1 year.
senior.
So really good stuff. So if we do not have anything else, Chandra,
Yeah.
so
I
do
have
we?
1 or 2 lines. Please give me a chance.
Yes,
Yeah. So my
yes, sure,
sincere
sure.
thanks to Satyaki, of course, for the wonderful lecture and taking out time from your busy schedule. My sincere thanks to Professor Shubhadeep Basu. He's the chairperson of this IEEE Computer Chapter Kolkata section, and he's really doing a wonderful move. This organizing lectures, and particularly like we had this. Kind of demand we have placed to him that we wish to hear from our alumni, and he is really listening to us, and he is taking all the initiative, so our heartfelt thanks to him on behalf of the computer chapter, and also to our IEEE student chapters, the different sections that we have, because they have provided really very nice support, all of them. And probably Prithijit, and Prithijit is from BTech B final year now. Do you know?
Yes, CSSBC, yes.
I think I don't know, because I think I would have left Jadavpur by the time he had joined, I guess.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah.
But they know you. So everybody
Yeah.
knows
These
you.
are,
So
these are
they
very
were
kind
really
words.
happy to have you.
It's a lot of
And they
expectations,
also,
and expectations is not good. It just creates burden.
and everything, like all the flyers, everything, all the Excel sheets, feedback forms, everything was prepared by CS student band chapter of IEEE, led by Prithiji is the chair, and many others. So
No, maybe.
uh,
Yeah.
they, they found, so they did a great job. So I can list a lot of names, but it's not important. But I
No, it
just
is
want to
important.
thank all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good. Yeah, I really love connecting with
Team effort,
from everyone from Jalpur. I think it's definitely for every student from Jalpur. I think that Jalpur University really holds a very sort of close place in their heart, and it's actually for multiple reasons. Yeah, so I definitely love connecting, and every time I go back, I actually try to go and visit some of my friends and juniors and all of that. So yeah, it's and especially I've seen that in our department, especially, we have really we had our seniors who had this doing the science clubs. We started this code club, and then there are things that are going on, and people actually take initiatives to sort of not just stay within the bounds of like pure sort of this course curriculum and all of that, and go beyond that, and that I think creates a lot of opportunities, and all of and then creates this scope for networking and all of that, and I think that's very, very useful. So it's really great to see that that's happening. So yeah, I'm just grateful to be included. Yeah.
So, thank you.
Chandra, any more words you want to add here? Any concluding lines?
Concluding lines.
I think
Then-
he's going to. Oh, right. Please share your email ID if you wish, because I think people will be questioning. I mean, they might have some questions in future also. Like,
yeah, where should I share it?
You can just send it in the chat box. Can you send me in the chat box? I can immediately put it in the comments or something.
yeah.
Just a minute. So this is the email ID for Satyaki. So in case you wish to contact, so please write. And I think he's quite active in LinkedIn as well. So I think you can find him there, and he should be happy.
So you are in AI group. So,
Yeah,
I
it's
mean, I can't figure it out. There were three group names that were there, probably AI in something I can't remember. I mean, in your LinkedIn profile.
so are you talking about AWS?
Yeah, in
Yeah,
AWS, you have written some AI in something. There was some labs, probably.
yeah. So we are essentially a part. I'm essentially part of this group called Recognition, which is a computer vision science team in AWS. It's led by Stefano Suarto of UCLA, and also to some extent advised by Pietro Verona. It's almost like an applied research org. So we are mostly focused on building AI products and services. And I'm actually at this point in life, I'm interested in seeing that. I actually want to see how applied research is being done, because how things happen in academia is a little bit different from how things happen in industry, because I feel like academia is mostly concerned about novelty, and that's very good, and it's actually more it's rewarding in sense of dopamine and all of that. But like in industry, things are a little bit different. People are more focused about perfection, because if a system works 90% of the time, it's not good. You have to make it work 99.99% of the time, then only it's probably good. So yeah, so I'm actually very interested to see how some of these ideas actually get used in the industry. Yeah, so that's what essentially I do in my job, and that's what I like to do for some time.
That's really
Thank you.
interesting. So, very aptly, he has summarized like academic research and industry, where the difference. Yeah, your abstractions are really good. Like
Well, maybe they are not my abstractions. I just
in
copied
your
them from other
presentation,
people.
in your
It's
presentation
good
as well,
because
I have seen that points.
this was actually one of our core ideas, like behind this webinar series, that we wanted to listen not from the seasoned people, like we are in also in touch with very senior people, and sometimes we get the perspective from the very top level. But this time we wanted to listen from the people like the passed out students from different institutes, not just from Jadavpur. We also have bright students passing out from other institutes. We also wanted to host them. We will host them in the subsequent series. And they are doing great in different fields. So first lecture was from the academia. Next, this one is from mix of academia and also in industries. So really wonderful lecture, Shatuki. So I also thank that a lot of people actually attended it live. Last lecture was from Jishnu was also viewed by 600, 700 people. So excellent views. And a lot of people also watched it live. So this one is also still going on live. So we are thankful to all the listeners actually who have joined us in YouTube live. So if we have no further questions, so I'll actually stop this broadcast, and
Yeah. So bye bye
with,
and
with
good night.
Yeah, it's good morning for me, but yeah, thank you once again
Yeah.
for inviting me. I really feel grateful and honored, and I love to connect, and hopefully that we will keep in touch, and keep on meeting again and again. Thank you. Okay, bye.
thank you very much. Bye bye.